Aristotle's Ethics, the Path to Virtue and the Beautiful Life. Welcome to Bytes. Today, we're exploring Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, an enduring work that seeks to uncover what it truly means to live well. Unlike many interpretations, Aristotle's approach to virtue isn't about passive routines or mindless habits. Instead, he introduces hexis, an active state of character, where virtue is a condition held with purpose and clarity. For Aristotle, virtue appears in action, not just any action, but actions chosen knowingly and with a sense of balance, a stable equilibrium of the soul. This equilibrium is what Aristotle believes forms our character. It's a state where a person can judge and act with consistency, choosing the good deliberately, rather than by accident or habit. The meaning of the mean. Now let's talk about Aristotle's concept of the mean. Often misunderstood, this idea is about finding a balance, not in a superficial sense, but as a form of clarity. Virtue, according to Aristotle, lies in the mean, a state of inner calm and focus that allows us to see things as they truly are, even amid life's pleasures and pains. The mean is a space where our soul finds clarity. Here, we can judge what's truly desirable, what's genuinely painful, and what actions will bring us closer to the good life. For Aristotle, achieving this balanced state is a process, a journey of clearing away distractions that cloud our judgment and stand in the way of the soul's full potential. Virtue and the beautiful. In Aristotle's view, moral virtue is essential for effective action. He believes that a person with good character sees the world differently. They perceive beauty as it truly is, and can recognize what is genuinely good. The virtuous person isn't just acting well, they're experiencing a connection to beauty, a beauty that inspires and informs every action. This idea is central to Aristotle's ethics. The sight of beauty sparks right desire and right reason within the virtuous person. Here, the soul reaches a middle ground, where actions aren't just habits but reflections of a deep love for the good. For Aristotle, beauty isn't merely an aesthetic quality, it's a guide, a true north that draws us toward what's right, natural, and free. In many discussions, the word habit is often thrown around when talking about Aristotle's ethics, as if it's the simple answer. I once attended a faculty seminar where the group seemed stuck on the idea that Aristotle believed the good life was merely a mindless routine. And just recently, I heard a lecture where the speaker praised Aristotle's thoughts on choice, but still criticized him for what they saw as a focus on habit, arguing that a good life requires spontaneity and openness, not just repetition. So, did Aristotle really believe that the best life excludes active thinking and choice? At first glance, that doesn't make sense. This idea might actually confuse the effect with the cause. Aristotle does emphasize that the way we are habituated from childhood makes a huge difference in how our lives unfold. He even says it makes all the difference. But does this mean that our lives are merely collections of habits? If this is what sticks in our memory and leads us to that conclusion, there's an easy fix, because habits aren't the only effects of habituation. Just because it's an essential cause doesn't mean it's the only cause. To work through this, let's first consider another influence that might lead us to this misinterpretation of Aristotle. It could be tempting to think that, no matter how we analyze the effects of habituation, we're left with the fact that Aristotle supposedly says virtues are habits. But here's the reply. He actually doesn't say that at all. What Aristotle does say is that moral virtue is a hexis. Some translators, like Hippocrates' apostle, have translated hexis as habit, but that's not quite right. The trouble, as often happens, comes from Latin. The Latin word habitus does translate well to the Greek hexis, but if this root leads us to habit in English, we've lost the original meaning. In fact, a hexis is almost the opposite of a habit. The concept of hexis also appears in Plato's Theaetetus. There, Socrates makes a point: knowledge can never be a mere passive possession, stored in the mind like birds in a cage. He contrasts the Greek word ktesis, meaning passive possession, with hexis, a kind of active holding that requires continuous effort. So while ktesis is passive, hexis requires that something be held in an active, engaged state. And this is what Aristotle means when he says moral virtue is a hexis. Virtue, then, is not about mindless repetition. It's an active condition. It's a state where something, virtue itself, must actively hold itself, never slipping into passivity. Some translators interpret Aristotle as saying that virtue is a disposition, or even a settled disposition, which certainly sounds better than calling it a simple habit. But even this phrasing sounds too passive to fully capture Aristotle's meaning. In De Anima, when Aristotle discusses how sense perception affects us, He clarifies that this isn't just a disposition or diathesis, but a hexis. His entire view of sensing and knowing hinges on this idea that our openness to the world outside us depends on a conscious, active effort, an effort to hold ourselves ready. In Book 7 of the Physics, Aristotle makes a similar point, this time about the way children begin to learn. When children start to learn, he explains, they aren't passively changed or trained in the way we might assume. Instead, they enter into an active state on their own, once they've been given the chance to settle from their natural state of disorder and distraction. Curtis Wilson, in a lecture at St. John's College, illustrated this concept beautifully by asking his audience to imagine what it would be like if we had to explicitly teach children every single detail of how to speak. We provide them with the tools, the language itself, but they, what Wilson calls little geniuses, do the hard work themselves. For Aristotle, the active condition of hexis is similar. It's something we cultivate, yes, but it's something we must hold on to, always ready to respond with awareness and effort. Virtue, then, is much more than a passive state. It's an active readiness, a dynamic state of being that requires constant and conscious engagement. Everyone at St. John's has likely thought about a kind of learning, one that doesn't rely on the teacher's authority or the student's memory. In Plato's Meno, this is called recollection. Aristotle, too, sees it as an active knowing, something already at work within us. In Plato's image, we draw knowledge up out of ourselves. In Aristotle's metaphor, we settle down into knowing. In both views, true learning isn't something someone else can train into us. Take Gorgias, who taught Meno the mannerisms of a knower. This training may resemble knowledge, but it lacks depth. Habits, even strong ones, don't reach into the soul's core. Authentic knowledge does. It engages the soul at its deepest level. Aristotle even connects this type of knowing to virtue. In Book 7 of the Physics, Aristotle describes knowledge and virtue as states that aren't imposed upon us or added on like parts of a structure. That would be, he says, like claiming we alter a house by putting a roof on it. In categories, Aristotle uses knowledge and virtue as examples of what he means by hexis. Hexis, he explains, is part of the larger category of dispositions, but it stands apart as something lasting and durable. Other dispositions like heat, cold, or sickness are passive states, easy to remove or change, but hexis, as Aristotle describes it, is an active, resilient state, one that becomes an enduring part of who we are. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle identifies moral virtue as a hexis in Book 2, Chapter 4. He clarifies this by separating it from other aspects of the soul, specifically from passive feelings and natural capacities. Aristotle makes a bold and fundamental claim here. Goodness isn't in the action itself, but in the person performing it. This insight forms the core of his ethics, and it's one we need to keep in mind as we explore further. For Aristotle, no action is inherently good, just, or courageous because of some quality within the action itself. Instead, virtue manifests in action only when a person holds themselves in a particular way while acting. And this is where hexis becomes crucial. The term hexis comes from the Greek phrase pos echon, which means the stance or state in which one holds oneself when acting. Aristotle explains further, an action counts as virtuous only when a person holds themselves in a stable equilibrium of the soul. I'm translating here from the Greek words bebaios kai amitakinetos. The first word means stably or having taken a stand, while the second doesn't mean rigid or immovable, but rather a state from which one can't be entirely shifted. Think of it as a balance, something like a weighted toy that pops back up whenever it's knocked over. This stable equilibrium of the soul is what we mean by having character. It's not simply the result of conditioning or habit. There's a story told about B.F. Skinner, the psychologist associated with behavior modification, where his students supposedly trained him to lecture from one corner of the room by nodding and smiling whenever he approached it, and frowning when he moved away. This is how habits are formed. We slip into them almost without noticing, or they're imposed on us, or we impose them on ourselves. Yet a person with many habits, it may still lack true character. Habits lead to repetitive and predictable behavior, but character provides moral equilibrium to a life. There's a significant difference here between a shallow consistency of action and a reliable depth from which those actions flow. Interestingly, character and habit are often thought of as related concepts. In Greek, they differ by only a slight change, transforming ethos to athos. But, in Aristotle's view, This small change marks a profound distinction. We've now returned to Aristotle's claim that character, ethos, is shaped by habit, ethos, but it should be clearer now that, while habit may play a role, it cannot be a direct part of character itself. So we need to explore how an active condition, like virtue, can emerge from a passive condition, and why this active state can only be achieved if the passive one has come first. Imagine it like a ladder, with different levels leading to true character at the top. At the highest rung, we have active states, like knowledge, moral virtues, and the combination of these virtues that make up a person's character. In the middle, we have the mere dispositions, which we've mentioned briefly as being too shallow and easily changed to really capture the depth of virtue. At the bottom, we find the habits, the small, passive, often mindless conditions like biting nails or overusing the word like. But there's one more rung below even the habits. This lowest rung is where we begin, ruled by desires and impulses. Unlike habits, which are passive but enduring, desires and impulses are passive but fleeting, yet extremely powerful. Think of a child who desperately clings to a desire or recoils in fear, a child who insists they must have a toy, or who screams if left in a dark room. These strong urges seem insurmountable at first, yet somehow, as adults, we've learned to overcome most of them. We may not banish these feelings entirely, but we develop the strength to handle them. And, as Aristotle observes, the impulses don't weaken, we get stronger. Aristotle doesn't offer much detail on how this transformation happens, but he does emphasize that we acquire virtues by practicing them. Through our interactions with others, some of us become just, while others become unjust. By acting in the face of fear or courage, some develop bravery, while others become cowardly. And by moderating our desires and passions, some grow gentle and moderate, while others remain spoiled and quick-tempered. Aristotle captures this journey by saying that when we act in a particular way, an active state results. This simple statement marks a crucial shift in the ethics, from the language of habit to the language of character. When read in the original Greek, the words used here are hexis and energia. Energia, which means being at work, isn't just repetitive behavior, no matter how regular. For Aristotle, being at work is an active, engaged state of living a virtue. It's this very idea, central to his thinking, that illuminates our journey out of childhood impulses and into the moral depth and maturity that come with character and virtue. The moral life can sometimes look a lot like the habits a society approves of and then imposes on its young. At St. John's College, for example, students still stand at the beginning and end of Friday night lectures. This tradition started with Stringfellow Barr, a founder of the current curriculum, who always stood when someone entered or left a room. What Barr considered good manners has, for us, become mere habit. This becomes obvious when you see a student stand politely at the start of a lecture, but then, out of boredom, leave halfway through. Here, the politeness was just for show, and the rudeness is the truth. But why isn't all habituation of the young just like this? When a parent makes a child repeatedly hold back from something they desire, or stay in a situation that frightens them, the child is starting to act as a moderate or brave person might. But what's actually going on inside the child? At one point I thought maybe it was just the parent's approval that became stronger than the child's own impulse. But I was persuaded by others in a study group that this alone wouldn't have any lasting value and wouldn't help in forming a true character. What seems more likely is that parental training serves more as a negative force, a way to weaken the irrational strength of our impulses and desires. We all start life already conditioned, in the habit of giving in to impulses and desires, of automatically easing the tension of pain, fear, or unmet desire in any way we can. And all of this happens before we're even capable of thinking or choosing. This is what people often call human nature, but in reality, blocks our access to our true, natural state. That's why Aristotle says, the virtues come about in us, neither by nature nor apart from nature. What we often think of as human nature or the state of nature is both natural and unnatural, the passive part of ourselves, reinforced by passive habits. Virtue, then, has the quality of a second nature, because it can't develop right from the start, nor evolve in a smooth line from our earliest state. And yet, it's only in the moral virtues that we reach what Aristotle calls our primary nature, the state in which all our capacities are able to fully flourish. For Aristotle, the mark of what is natural is pleasure, but we have to understand what this pleasure truly signifies. Things that are naturally pleasant have no opposite pain or excess. Yes, because they simply free us to act as our true selves. This is why Aristotle calls the life of virtue pleasant in itself, or in its own right. A mere habit that forces us to act against our inclinations can't be a virtue, because an unmistakable sign of this is we don't actually like it. However, Aristotle points out that our first, or childish nature, is never completely erased. This is why he says our nature is not simple. It holds something within us that makes our happiness vulnerable and makes us crave change, even when it's change for the worse. But only through moral virtues can our soul find true harmony and experience the most lasting pleasures. The path to these virtues isn't complex. It's simply what all parents do when they stop a child from grabbing something they desire, or keep them from running away from a source of irrational fear. The child acts as if they had virtue, even if they don't yet possess it. This is what Shakespeare's Hamlet describes to his mother as he tries to train her toward virtue in a time that's out of joint. He tells her, "Assume a virtue if you have it not. That monster custom who all sense doth eat. Of habits evil is angel yet in this, that to the use of actions fair and good, he likewise gives a frock or livery that aptly is put on." Hamlet suggests that by refraining tonight, it will become easier to abstain tomorrow, and easier still the next day. With use, he says, even custom can almost change the stamp of nature. In this moment from Hamlet, Prince is talking to a middle-aged woman about lust, but the pattern he describes works just as well for a 5-year-old with candy. We can now see that it isn't nature that needs to be changed, but rather the earliest stamp of habit. In fact, we can drop Hamlet's almost and clear away the paradox. The reason we need habit is to change the stamp of habit. A habit of giving into impulse can be counteracted by developing a habit of resisting impulse. However, this second habit isn't virtue. It's only a kind of mindless inhibition, an automatic repressing of all impulses. And having both opposing habits doesn't create virtue either. Instead, it only creates a neutral state, a kind of balance. Something else has to replace habit. Aristotle's idea of energia, or being at work, suggests that this shift happens on its own, without the need to impose anything new. Habituation then doesn't stifle nature, but instead allows nature to reveal itself. Aristotle's description in Book 7 of the Physics of how children first begin to learn fits just as well with how human character starts to form. We settle down from the turbulence of childhood into what we are by nature. Earlier, we saw that habituation is only the start of the journey to virtue, not the end. Aristotle's order of states of the soul begins with habit, moves to being at work, and finally reaches the hexis, or active state, that gives the soul moral strength. If the human soul didn't have this being at work, this natural and unchanging activity, then there could be no moral strength, only customs. Early on, while exploring the idea of happiness, Aristotle asks, could it make sense to say that a carpenter or shoemaker has work to do, but a human being, as such, does not? His answer, of course, is that nature has given us work to do. Without it, we are necessarily unhappy, and this work is to put our power of reason into action. Now, Aristotle doesn't say that everyone must be a philosopher, or that human life is defined solely by reason's activity, but he does say that our work is to bring the power of logos into action. Later, Aristotle clarifies that irrational impulses are no less a part of our humanity than reasoning is. His point here is that, as human beings, our desires don't have to be mindless or random. They can be transformed by thinking into choices, desires informed by deliberation. The distinctly human way of being at work is a threefold activity: seeing an end, thinking about the means to achieve it, and choosing an action. Responsible human action depends on combining all the powers of the soul: perception, imagination, reasoning, and desire. These are all powers that are at work within us constantly. Good parental training doesn't create them, mold them, or alter them, but instead, it sets them free to become effective in action. In this way, according to Aristotle, and despite the influences of parents, society, and nature, we are co-authors of the active states of our own souls. This discussion has shown that habit truly shapes our lives without being the only thing that molds them or the final form they take. And it also opens the door to understanding one of the more puzzling ideas in ethics: Aristotle's insistence that moral virtue is, by its very nature, a mean condition. At first glance, this sounds strange. Using quantitative terms, measuring things by numbers, feels far removed from real human experience. We might assume that numbers would only come into play metaphorically, but Aristotle is clear. He says, by its thinghood and by the account that unfolds what it is for it to be, virtue is a mean. This statement has led some to, well, rather shallow interpretations. One recent article, for instance, reduces the idea of virtue to a kind of number scale, suggesting that if courage is 0, cowardice might be -3, and rashness +3. This interpretation treats virtue as if it's something we tune into, like a radio station on an analog dial, where the goal is to simply lower the absolute value of your vice. For those who don't interpret it this literally, there's still the idea that Aristotle might be praising a kind of mediocrity, like the gentleman's C, once sought by students trying to get by without standing out. But can this really be the goal of moral virtue? Such a cautious approach seems timid, aiming for nothing more than blending into one's social surroundings, where virtue is never actively chosen over a popular vice. This clearly isn't the courage Aristotle is talking about. Aristotle actually points out twice that every moral virtue is an extreme, yet he keeps that idea secondary to a more profound sense, in which virtue is indeed a mean. Could there be something valid, though, to the idea that we hone in on virtue from two sides? A wonderful image of this kind of process appears in Donald McCaig's novel, Nop's Trials. Here, the protagonist isn't a human being, but a border collie named Nop. The author describes how Nop has to find the perfect balance point, the exact distance behind a herd of sheep, to drive them forward as a unified mass. If the dog gets too close, the sheep panic and scatter. If he's too far back, they ignore him altogether and wander to graze. A good working dog, though, constantly adjusts his pace to stay in that precise, mean position that keeps the sheep moving in the right direction. Now, border collies are known for being brave, tireless, and intensely determined. Some have been documented running over 100 miles in a day, driven by sheer love for their work. There's no doubt that these dogs display a kind of virtue, but it's not human virtue, and not even the same type. Some human activities do require a similar, sustained tension, like a sheepdog's constant state of balance. Tightrope walking might capture a similar feeling. But Aristotle's idea of virtue for humans doesn't rely on constant anxiety or delicate tension. Instead, it rests on a stable equilibrium within the soul. In fact, we might have stumbled upon Aristotle's meaning behind the mean by recognizing that habits can be necessary for countering other habits. Aristotle mentions this idea with examples like straightening warped boards or aiming away from the worst extreme. He even advises guarding against the temptations of pleasure. For example, the habit of abstaining from bodily pleasure is, in some sense, the opposite extreme from the childish habit of giving in to every desire. But on their own, either of these habits is a vice. People enslaved to every impulse, whether it's gluttony, drunkenness, or other pleasures, clearly can't be happy. But the opposite extreme, which Aristotle describes as a kind of numbness or denial of the senses, also misses the mark. True virtue lies somewhere between. It might seem then that temperance in relation to, say, food, is just about finding the right quantity, figuring out how many ounces of chocolate mousse to enjoy. Aristotle's example of Milo the wrestler, who needs more food to sustain him, suggests this, but that isn't quite the point. The example of Milo is only meant to show that there's no single right action for every person or every circumstance, and this example isn't strictly comparable to temperance with food. What matters isn't a perfect amount of food, but a right relationship to the pleasure of eating. Imagine this. You've been saving a bowl of chocolate mousse all day for a mid-evening treat. Just as you're about to indulge, a friend unexpectedly arrives. Now, if you're a glutton, you might hide the mousse until they leave, or gobble it down before you even open the door. If you lean toward the opposite extreme and have rigidly denied yourself all indulgences, you probably don't have chocolate mousse, or any other treat, to offer your visitor at all. But if you found a balanced state of the soul in these matters, you're neither enslaved to nor shut off from the pleasure of eating. You can share the treat, enhancing your friend's visit with something enjoyable. In this case, what you're sharing isn't just the 6 ounces of chocolate mousse, but the pleasure of eating it. A pleasure that can't be reduced to any exact measurement. If bodily pleasures control you, or if you've rejected them entirely, you're missing the natural role these pleasures can play. But In the mean between these two extremes, you're free to notice possibilities that serve good ends and to act on them. It's worth noting that the mean here isn't necessarily 3 ounces of moose. If 2 friends had shown up, you'd be willing to eat even 2 ounces instead. This isn't about dividing food, it's about multiplying pleasure. And what's interesting here is how universally we recognize that sharing the treat is the right thing to do. This recognition is immediate, though it's a special kind of perception, not one of the 5 senses. Aristotle compares it to seeing that a triangle is the simplest shape into which a polygon can be divided. It's a thoughtful, imaginative kind of seeing, and yet it has to be seen. Our childish habits can cloud this perception, but forming counter habits clears it up. This is why Aristotle says that a person of moral stature, the spoudios, sees things as they truly are. Once our early habits have been set aside, our desires disentangle from that constant pressure for immediate gratification. We can think clearly, calmly, and see what lies before us in its full potential. The mean, in this case, isn't a point to adjust up or down. It's a clearing in the midst of pleasures and pains that lets us judge what truly seems pleasant and painful. Achieving temperance toward bodily pleasures is about finding this mean, but it isn't simply adjusting a single condition up or down. The person who constantly fights the same battle, struggling to maintain that balance point between too much and too little indulgence, doesn't actually possess the virtue of temperance. According to Aristotle, they are at best self-restrained or continent. Here, the reasoning part of the soul keeps the impulses reined in, but these impulses can slip the reins and go their own way, much like parts of the body in people with certain nerve disorders. This form of control in self-restrained people is an anxious, unstable equilibrium that falters when vigilance drops. It's the old conflict between head and heart, never resolved, only periodically subdued. In a soul divided between rational and irrational parts, there could never be unity, only compromise at best, with each side believing they have different interests. But in a virtuous soul, it's different. Here, all parts blend into one unified human being coming together harmoniously in the act of choice. This could very well be the best way to understand the active state of the soul that Aristotle believes constitutes moral virtue and forms character. It's a condition in which all powers of the soul are working together, enabling actions that engage the whole human being. Achieving character is a process of clearing away obstacles, anything that stands in the way of the soul's full efficacy. For someone drawn excessively to food or always avoiding trouble, or even looking for trouble, life becomes limited, partial. But when the full power of the soul is at play, choices that emerge will have the distinctive qualities we associate with virtues, qualities like courage, temperance, virtue itself. Now, this idea of character as we're discussing it, this stability, actually comes from the Greek word character, meaning a distinctive mark. Though Aristotle doesn't use character in the Nicomachean Ethics, he does emphasize ethos, or moral character. In this sense, a person of character embodies a human form with strengths deep and dependable. Someone with character is reliable, not easily swayed, because they've taken a stand within their mature nature and cannot be easily moved from it. Yet Aristotle also acknowledges that bad character exists, which he calls vice, different from mere bad habits or weaknesses. It's entirely possible, Aristotle says, for someone with free will to continually choose bodily pleasure or greed. Virtue, then, is a mean. First, because it emerges from a balance between opposing habits, and second, because it stands between them, neither extreme ruling it. Thinking is involved here, but it's not a matter of principle alone. Aristotle notes that even vice can be a matter of principle. Some might believe that always following an extreme path, either toward or away from pleasure, is correct. 1146b at 22-3. Consider a true glutton. They're not merely indulging in a bad habit. They've made a conscious choice on principle that one should always give in to their desire for food. Plato's Gorgias offers a similar idea, as Callicles argues that food, drink, and sex ought to be indulged without restraint. Though Callicles is serious and still open to being persuaded, his only alternative seems to be complete denial of bodily pleasures, a life that he believes would be fit only for stones or the dead. 492e. This contrast is where attempts to define right action often stumble. For example, in the role of a seminar leader, what is the right balance? Should the leader ask questions but never give opinions? Or should they share everything they've learned? Which principle should guide them? that all learning should come from the learners, or that teaching requires prior instruction? Is there a hybrid principle? Or is the virtue of the role something entirely different? Just as indulgent habits are opposed to habits of abstinence, every principle of action has an opposite principle. Good habits may prevent us from being overtaken by strong impulses, and the exercise of intelligence may allow us to see both sides of a question. But then, what governs the choice of the mean? Aristotle gives this answer. Such things are among particulars, and the judgment is in the act of sense perception, 1109b 23-4. But it's a sense perception that is actively engaged with thought, rich in meaning. The origin of virtuous action is neither pure intellect nor sheer appetite. Instead, it's a fusion of intellect and appetite, working together for the sake of something greater. Aristotle describes this union as anthropos, the human being, 1139a 34b s7. To ensure that actions have moral depth, Aristotle believes that thinking must bring forth right reason, ho, orthos logos, and our appetites must contribute right desire, he or the orexis, 1114b, 29, 1139a, 24-6, 31-2. What makes these right isn't simply intellectual, but rather something more intuitive, something that's accessible through this thoughtful perception. And this brings us to a third crucial idea that we need to explore further. Aristotle says clearly what moral virtue aims at, though translations often blur the clarity. Translators often describe this aim as the noble or the fine, but neither term quite captures Aristotle's intent. To us, noble might sound like high-minded but impractical idealism, whereas Aristotle considers moral virtue as deeply practical, enabling effective action. Fine fares worse, conjures fragility, even delicateness, when Aristotle describes moral virtue as resilient and enduring. In truth, Aristotle's term is to kalon, which means the beautiful. He asserts that virtues such as courage and generosity are performed for the sake of the beautiful, an idea central to his ethical framework. To Aristotle, one of good character, someone who acts from right reason and right desire, must first perceive the beautiful. Why avoid the beautiful? One Loeb translator argues that to kalon has multiple meanings, ranging from well-formed objects to well-done actions. However, Aristotle frequently compares moral acts to well-made art, each achieving an ideal form. For Aristotle, the beautiful applies to all virtuous acts, as it does to a crafted artwork. Consider characters in Greek tragedies. Antigone, who considers her defiant act a beautiful thing to die doing, or Neoptolemus, who refuses to let Philoctetes use a weapon for revenge because this is not a beautiful thing. In both cases, the beautiful signifies the moral rightness and integrity of the act. Everyday language reflects this usage as well. Think of a mother saying, "Don't be so ugly," to her child, or the casual compliment, "That was a beautiful thing you did." Both hint at a moral standard that Aristotle also recognizes. The beautiful is that which is truly right, and our judgment of the good is grounded in a direct perception of beauty. Aristotle often refines his key concepts by examining layered meanings, evident in his inquiries into being in the metaphysics or motion in the physics. In ethics, he similarly identifies three core types of goods: the pleasant, the beautiful, and the beneficial. The beneficial drops from later lists, leaving us with the beautiful and the pleasant as the highest forms of good. For Aristotle, it is the beautiful that guides moral choice, more than even the pleasant. Aristotle's emphasis on the beautiful surfaces consistently in his ethics. Moral virtues involve seeing and choosing an act for its own sake, recognizing it as beautiful. For example, courage is virtuous not when it seeks honor or revenge, but when pursued purely for the beautiful. Temperance similarly finds its purpose in the beautiful when it tempers our indulgences, like sharing a special treat rather than consuming it alone. The temperate person aims not merely for pleasure, but for the beauty of generosity, finding greater joy in sharing than in hoarding. Aristotle emphasizes that the truly pleasurable life is one that centers on the beautiful rather than on immediate gratification. Yet Aristotle intriguingly excludes the beautiful from his discussion of justice in Book 5 of the Ethics, despite justice's stature among moral virtues. It's a notable absence, though we might infer that Aristotle views justice as incomplete. if it does not aspire to the beautiful. Justice, after all, governs fairness, rewarding and punishing in the name of social order. But Aristotle elevates friendship above justice, suggesting that friends in harmony require no justice between them. Friendship in this sense becomes the deeper virtue, embodying the beautiful more fully than justice ever could. So, what is the purpose of justice according to Aristotle? He implies that its true aim is homonoia, or like-mindedness, a harmony that enables communal action. Friendship achieves this harmony naturally, making justice unnecessary where friendship exists. Friendship, in Aristotle's view, is beautiful. His analysis reveals friendships based on use, pleasure, or the beautiful, the last being friendship grounded in mutual respect for each other's character. Here, Aristotle repeatedly connects friendship with the beautiful, as when he describes selfless acts or financial support to family as acts of beauty, not duty. The beauty inherent in friendship reaches its apex in Aristotle's view of a just society. If everyone strove for the beautiful, he claims, then every need would be met, for virtuous people would willingly sacrifice wealth and honor to achieve beauty. The beautiful is no mere object to be admired. It is the primary good, motivating actions and guiding choices. This emphasis on the beautiful, as Aristotle sees it, is not limited to human ethics, but extends into the very structure of the cosmos. In De Anima, he describes how the soul, though self-moving in its choices, is ultimately drawn by the unmoving beauty it perceives as its highest good. This idea evolves into the concept of the unmoved mover in the metaphysics, where Aristotle envisions a cosmic order led by the beautiful, an unmoving source that draws everything to it, not through force, but as something loved and inherently good. The beautiful in the ethics is not simply an abstract ideal, but is the source of action. Beauty evokes wonder, Aristotle suggests, a quality of perception that allows things to be seen as they truly are. Wonder holds our assumptions and judgments in suspension, allowing beauty's essence to appear without being distorted by our desires or opinions. Aristotle describes this wonder as the ultimate effect of moral virtue, the ability to see truly, judge rightly, and perceive the beauty that others might overlook. This vision of beauty aligns right reason with right desire, harmonizing the soul's faculties and allowing a person to respond freely and naturally to the beauty in life's moral choices. In this way, Aristotle's ethics presents beauty not merely as a side effect of virtue, but as its very heart, the highest goal that calls the soul into action and fulfillment. It is beauty, both in action and in character, that allows one to live well, achieving a life of profound purpose and harmony. And ultimately, this beauty remains the guiding force, the good itself, inspiring virtue and fostering the flourishing of the soul. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and his exploration of virtue, character, and the role of beauty in the good life. I hope this video has offered you some new perspectives on Aristotle's timeless ideas and how they challenge us to think about our own lives, our choices, and the virtues we aspire to. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what parts resonated most with you. And don't forget to subscribe for more philosophy content and insights into classic ideas that still shape the world today. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and let the beautiful guide you in all that you do. Thanks for watching.